Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to this dialogue. Today on the show, we will be discussing the complex geopolitical dynamics in the Horn of Africa. And in this regard, I'm joined by Lawrence Freeman, who knows a lot about the dynamic nature of the Horn. He's a political economic analyst for Africa with a great deal of expertise in the area. So he will give us insights into the increasing international presence in the Horn, the shifting power balances, and the challenges, especially posed against Ethiopia. I'm your host, Shipara Olako. Do stay with us. Mr. Freeman, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure to be with you.
So let's first off talk about the continent of Africa vis-a-vis the seat at the UN Security Council. So what are the potential implications of the US supporting permanent seats for African nations at the UN Security Council, but also opposing veto power for them? How could this shape African influence on global issues?
Okay, thank you. It's obvious for many years, and I think China and other countries have advocated for the African countries to be represented on the United Nations Security Council, which is the key body of the United Nations in terms of deciding policy. And this is long overdue, especially given the fact that the Africa continent in the next 20, 25 years will be the dominant continent on the planet in terms of population growth and potential economic growth. So this is the correct decision. I know that some people call for two countries to be put on the UN Security Council. One would be rotating, one would be permanent. The question is, since the formation of the United Nations, pretty much, you've had 5 countries with veto power. And that's been a big issue among a lot of nations in the world, that these countries can decide whether a resolution is supported or not. So I don't know what the best formula is going to be. I think representation of the AU at the Group of 20, I think representation of Africa at the United Nations, these, I believe, are long overdue and very positive developments.
While this is the case, while the United States of America has allowed the African nations to have a seat at the UN Security Council, it has opposed the veto power of the African nations. So what exactly does this mean? You know, while it is allowing it to have the seat at the UN Security Council, it's also opposing having veto power. What do you make out of this?
Well, don't forget, you have a Security Council, I think, I'm trying to remember the exact number, maybe 12 or 16 members, but there's only 5 permanent members, and the others rotate. And the 5 permanent members are the only ones with veto power. So there's a very clear restriction in the UN Security Council that they've maintained now over several decades. And this has been challenged by many different countries who oppose this kind of only 5 members. I have not yet studied the question thoroughly whether additional members should be added to the permanent 5 in terms of veto power. I think it's a reasonable suggestion. I think it's thoughtful given the nature of the role that Africa continent is going to play. But then again, which country is going to be represented? Right now, Africa has 54, 55 nations. Should one of those nations be on the permanent 5 permanently, the way the United States, China, Russia, Britain, etc.? So those are difficult questions that have to be worked through. And well, I am not in a position to say what is the best approach at this moment.
As you know, Djibouti has recently decided to allow Ethiopia to use the Tajura port. So how do you assess Djibouti's recent decision to allow Ethiopia to use this port, the Tajura port? And what could this mean to the regional balance of power and the economic stability in general?
Well, you have to start from the standpoint that Ethiopia, with 120 million people and a growing economy, that if they do not make some mistakes, should continue to expand. And this, the Ethiopian economy and the population will be the dominant driving force in the entire region, in the Horn of Africa and in East Africa as well. And therefore, it has to have a port. How this comes about, this is the tricky question, but there is, from any reasonable, thoughtful standpoint, and especially from an economic standpoint, Ethiopia needs to have a port. Now, the Djibouti has offered the management of a port, but my understanding is that Ethiopia wants to actually have ownership of a port. It doesn't have to be permanent ownership. It could be a leased ownership of 50 years or 99 years. I don't know all the details, and they would pay for it. And I think there is a danger in not having some ownership of the port, because if you're just allowing the port to be managed, then the host country has somewhat of control over your situation and can withdraw that offer at any point. So therefore, I would really advocate a long-term transactional ownership relationship is the best way forward.
Let's also take some time and talk about Egypt. As you know, Egypt's escalating involvement in the Horn of Africa through military support for Somalia has raised concerns. So how do you see this evolving, and what are the broader risks for regional stability?
Well, as people who follow me on Twitter and my website, I've spoken out very forcefully that this is a stupid but also dangerous move, policy by Egypt. There are lots of complications in the Horn of Africa, which we can go through in this discussion. But to have yet another nation that is not connected to the Horn of Africa, I mean, the Nile River flows from the Blue Nile into Sudan and Sudan north into Egypt, but that doesn't make them part of the Horn of Africa. Their involvement is entirely geopolitical, and it's very unwanted, because sending more military support into an area where we shouldn't be discussing war at all, zero, not only has a number of foolish people, including governments, discussed openly the question of war between Somalia and Ethiopia, which is stupid. I mean, I can't understand the thinking of these people. But now to have an outside country meddling in by sending in, I believe, the second shipment of military support, this is adding, as we say, fuel to the fire. And Egypt is not doing it because it has concern for the Horn of Africa. Egypt has a long-standing problem with Ethiopia. And this goes back to when Egypt was so-called given control of the Nile by the British in 1903. They have a long-standing problem with recognizing and working with Ethiopia in terms of regional and actually continental African development. And they unfortunately have imbued the geopolitical mentality of zero-sum game. And they believe that they have to put down Ethiopia to maintain their hegemony. And this is really foolish thinking. This is the way the imperialists and colonials think. This is the way the rules-based international order think. So they are adding, complicating the situation. They're making the situation more dangerous. And they really should step back and think about what is beneficial to the whole Horn of Africa, which is economic development, which will be driven by Ethiopia. So we're lacking a quality of statesmanship among leaders in the region, and we're lacking an understanding of physical economic growth. And we also have mixed in with that the old legacies of colonialism, of my country was colonialized, my country is now liberated, you're trying to colonialize me. And this is a unsafe combustible mixture, which I am very concerned could break out into war. I don't say it's going to happen now, but I'm concerned it could happen. And given what the Ethiopia has been through and the poverty in this entire region, having a war would be the worst possible outcome for Africa. And thoughtful African heads of state and heads of state around the world should impress that upon people who are meddling in the Horn of Africa now.
That's interesting. So I think I should ask you this question as well. Why is it that Somalia is being used, if you will, by Egypt? Why is it taking such a course of action, and why is it being a battleground, proxy battleground, if you will, for Egypt? What is it gonna gain out of this?
Well, that's a good question, because I think you have internal problems, internal that is to Africa. And I was describing the fact that unfortunately, Egypt has adopted a colonialist viewpoint, or a viewpoint of the rules-based order, that Ethiopia's growth will diminish their hegemony, or their believed hegemony in the region. So they are using Somalia and manipulating Somalia for their own gains. Now, the question is that the only policy or the only people intervening into the region? And I would say no. You have outside forces. You have various individuals who've been associated with various imperialist, colonialist policies, various governments, who also would like to see Ethiopia a weakened nation, and B, thinks they would have an advantage or benefit from chaos, war, and destabilization of the Horn of Africa. So there's outside forces outside that continent of Africa, and then there's meddlers outside of the region. And you have to overlay this on top of the existing problems that Somalia has vis-a-vis Somaliland, Puntland. And this is another complication that goes back to the colonial period of 1960 or so. So you add all this together, and this is a very dangerous mixture that could lead to war. And I think it's unfortunate that we don't have enough leaders in the world that is putting a stop to this discussion of war and these deployments which could lead to war.
Absolutely, that's beautifully put. Beautifully put. So, still staying on Egypt and Somalia, sir, given Egypt's arms support to Somalia, particularly in a region, as you know, plagued by Al-Shabaab, how should regional governments balance the need for security with the risks of militarization leaking into terrorist hands?
Well, this is a real consideration. That's why what the Egyptians are doing is so foolish, and it's very narrow-minded, because the total purpose is to prevent Ethiopia from having more economic growth and influence in the region. So it's a very dangerous, short-sighted policy. So it brings up all these questions around security. Ethiopia has had thousands of troops inside Somalia for quite a long time fighting al-Shabaab. And when Somalia says, well, we're now prepared to go to war against Ethiopia, if it wasn't so dangerous, it would be laughable. Somalia's not capable of going to war against anyone, and nor should they. Nor should Ethiopia be involved in any activities that could lead to war. There has to be a way through the governments of the region to deal with the question that Ethiopia requires ownership of a port. There's a lot of still discussion over January 1st MOU, and this is a very tricky issue, but it's an issue that could be discussed because Somaliland has a very unique relationship to Somalia, going back to 1960 and 1961. So it's a legitimate issue to be discussed by those in the region. And the first order of business is we're not going to conduct any military confrontations. We're going to decide what's in the best self-interest of all the nations. And this is where the lack of statesmanship and the lack of understanding of physical economic growth is a problem. Because if you look at the thing clearly, Ethiopia having a port and expanding its trade will help Eritrea, will help Somalia, will help Somaliland. All of the nations in the region will benefit from increased trade. Somalia could say, fine, let's work out a deal on a port and we will see economic benefits. Let's discuss how that will work. Egypt is not in this equation in an immediate form. They will also benefit from this economic growth, but they're a little bit narrow-minded at the moment. They don't see it. But we lack that quality of thinking. Instead, you have a lot of rhetoric. And I don't read Amharic or Arabic, so I can't say exactly what is being said. But the rhetoric is unnecessary. What we need is thoughtful statesmen who understand economic growth and are committed to a policy that will benefit the self-interest of every nation, their nation and the other nations. And this, unfortunately, is not yet understood by the leaders of the region.
Let's also talk about Sudan. As you know, the ongoing war in Sudan has created a humanitarian disaster and impacted neighboring countries. In this regard, what roles do you think external powers like Egypt and Ethiopia as well are playing in the conflicts? And what are the risks of spillover violence?
Well, the situation in Sudan is very troubling. It's a lot of people are dying needlessly. I spent a number of years in Sudan during the 1990s and 2000, and I think my last visit may have been around 2018 or so. This all could have been avoided. And the problem was that the sanctioning of the West and the activities of the International Criminal Court against the government of Ethiopia, in particular General Bashir, strangled Sudan from realizing its full economic potential, especially its agricultural potential, which is enormous. And there have been constant attempts at regime change and overthrowing the government. The demonstrations that began in 2019 were motivated by economic poverty. And I would discuss this constantly with the Sudan government and the ruling party, the National Congress Party. And I told them, unless you deal with this question of economic development with extended infrastructure, you're going to be overthrown. And they dismissed it. So now we've had 5 years or so of conflict as a result of warring parties inside Sudan, which is tearing the nation apart. There is no simple solution. I don't believe that Europe or the United States has any leverage in this situation at all. I think the only solution that's possible will come from the neighboring countries in the region and other countries associated with the African Union. Now, both Ethiopia and Egypt border Sudan. So they are the right people, the right governments to intervene and try to find a solution, which also means they have to be working together on the situation in the Horn of Africa. So the conflict in the Horn, with Egypt meddling in, complicates the situation in Sudan. But I don't see the United States, which I know pretty well, has any leverage in the situation. Maybe some of the Gulf countries do, and I don't think Europe has any. Egypt does, for going back thousands of years. They have a historical connection to Sudan, and Ethiopia has a historical connection to Sudan, and all three of them are connected by the Nile River. So there is a basis of finding a solution, but it's going to have to come from within Africa. It's not going to be coming from the West, especially.
What a brilliant idea and great insights. Lawrence Freeman, political and economic analyst for Africa. Thank you so much for giving me some of your precious time.
My pleasure as always.
Well, the viewers, thank you as well for having been with us so far. Until I see you next time with another program, it's goodbye from me, Shvarak.